On September 1, 1939, the winter after the Great War, the city of Geneva felt deceptively calm. Snow softened the edges of buildings still scarred by loss, and the lake reflected a world eager to believe it had learned something. Inside a newly finished hall, delegates gathered beneath flags that promised unity. They spoke many languages, but their hope was shared. Never again. Among them sat Elias Vogel, a minor legal advisor from a country too small to be feared and too large to be ignored. He had not fought at the front, but he had buried a brother who never returned. Elias believed in rules the way others believed in faith. Rules, he thought, were how fragile people survived powerful ones. The League was born from that belief. Words were drafted carefully, as if precision alone could restrain ambition. Disputes would be debated, not fought. Borders would be respected. Violence would be punished, not by vengeance, but by unity. Yet even as the ink dried, Elias noticed what was missing. There was no army waiting beyond the doors. No force that answered to the collective will. Enforcement, it turned out, required agreement not just in principle but in pain. And pain was something no one was willing to promise again. The British delegate spoke softly about exhaustion. France spoke of cemeteries that still filled the countryside. America sent encouragement, then drifted away, its attention pulled homeward. Each absence was explained. Each hesitation sounded reasonable. Together, they formed something else entirely. Outside the hall, veterans begged for work. In defeated nations, bitterness hardened into stories of betrayal. In victorious ones, relief turned quickly into forgetfulness. The war was over, people said. Let the future take care of itself. Elias watched as compromises piled up like sandbags, meant to hold back disaster, but never tested against real pressure. He heard diplomats reassure one another that no nation would dare defy the collective will. After all, the cost would be too great. But cost to whom? When the first small crisis arrived, it did not look like a threat. It was distant, tangled in history, explained away by complexity. A violation was noted. Commission was formed. A report was written. Time passed. The world kept turning. Elias began to understand the danger of systems built on consensus alone. Consensus required patience. Aggression required only a decision. He remembered a conversation late one evening, after most of the delegates had left. An older man, gray, careful, brilliant, had stared at the League's charter and sighed. "We have outlawed war," he said almost proudly. Then, after a pause, "But we have not outlawed the will to power." That sentence stayed with Elias. Every rule, he realized, was a question posed to the future. Will you obey me even when it costs you? And every unanswered challenge was an answer in itself. Years later, when borders shifted without resistance and speeches replaced action, Elias would think back to Geneva. He would remember how confident they had been that reason could outrun ambition. How certain they were that the memory of horror was enough to prevent its return. They had mistaken trauma for deterrence. The flaw was not that the League lacked ideals. It was that it relied on restraint in a world where restraint was unevenly distributed. Those who feared war most became its least effective opponents. Those willing to risk it discovered they could move faster than anyone could respond. By the time men began marching again, the lesson had already been taught. Not once, but repeatedly. The rules existed. Everyone knew them, and everyone knew they would not be enforced. When the first shot finally came years later, it did not shatter the peace. It merely confirmed what had long been true. Silence had chosen sides. No army marched under a banner that read conquest. They marched under banners that spoke of justice. In Berlin, the speeches were careful. Maps were unfolded, not like weapons but like evidence. Red lines traced borders that had once existed, borders that men in distant rooms had erased with pens. Villages were named. Languages counted. Families described. The claim was simple and sounded almost reasonable. These people are German. Therefore, this land is unfinished business. Not expansion, reunification. Not aggression, correction. Those who listened from abroad felt the unease but struggled to name it. The argument was wrapped in history, padded with grievance. To oppose it meant opposing the idea that nations had memory, that people belonged somewhere. Resistance began to feel abstract, even cruel. In Tokyo, the language was colder, sharper, dressed in necessity rather than nostalgia. Officials spoke of coal, grain, and steel. They spoke of population curves and shrinking margins. Manchuria was not described as a foreign land, but as a lifeline. Without it, Japan would choke. Without action, the nation would wither. Survival, they said, was not aggression. It was my responsibility. When reports of violence surfaced, they were buried beneath charts and statistics. How could a country be blamed for feeding itself? In Rome, the past was summoned like a witness. The empire had existed once. Therefore, it could exist again. Abyssinia was not invaded. It was reclaimed by history itself. Mussolini's voice filled balconies and radios, invoking Rome, destiny, civilization. Italians were told they were not conquering a people, but elevating them. Gas drifted across villages far from the speeches. In Spain, the justification wore a different uniform. Chaos, disorder, godlessness. Franco's supporters spoke of burning churches and broken traditions. They did not say they were overthrowing a government. They said they were restoring order. They were not killing opponents. They were saving Spain from itself. Each justification was different. The structure was the same. Every act of violence arrived wearing the mask of legality. Documents were produced. Referendums promised. Emergencies declared. The word invasion was avoided. Correction was preferred. Protection, stabilization, historical necessity. And democracies hesitated. Because how do you oppose a correction without sounding unreasonable? How do you mobilize armies against arguments wrapped in law, identity, and fear? How do you explain to exhausted populations that peace must be broken to preserve it? Debates replaced decisions. Committees argued over definitions while facts on the ground hardened into permanence. Each delay strengthened the aggressor's claim. Each compromise made the next step easier. The men who ordered the marches understood something their opponents did not. Legitimacy did not need to be true. It only needed to be plausible long enough to act. By the time the violence could no longer be denied, it was already old news. Borders had shifted. Governments had fallen. New realities demanded acceptance. And the lesson spread quietly, from capital to capital, spoken not in public but understood in private. If you justify first, you may act freely afterward. Correction had become conquest. Only now, no one could say exactly when the line had been crossed. The men who planned the marches learned quickly that force alone was never enough. Force frightened, but justification disarmed. A soldier with a rifle could be resisted. A claim wrapped in legality demanded debate. In Berlin, files were stacked neatly on polished tables. Census data, old treaties, maps from before the war, each document carefully selected to tell a story of continuity rather than rupture. The language was precise, almost academic. German-speaking populations, historical borders, unfair exclusions. When officials spoke of movement, they spoke of restoration. Troops were not advancing. They were returning. The word conquest never appeared. It didn't need to. Across Europe, diplomats read the memoranda with unease. The arguments were troubling, but not easily dismissed. After all, the borders had been drawn hastily. Minorities did exist. The law, which was supposed to restrain violence, was now being used to explain it. To oppose the claim meant challenging not just power, but principle. In Tokyo, the justifications were framed in colder terms. There were no romantic speeches about ancestry or lost homelands. Instead, there were calculations. Imports versus population. Production versus consumption. Charts showed a nation boxed in by geography and necessity. Manchuria was presented not as foreign soil, but as an extension of survival itself. Without it, Japan would starve. With it, stability could be guaranteed. When critics spoke of invasion, the response was immediate and calm. This was self-defense. No nation, they said, could be expected to perish quietly. The logic was brutal, but it was also familiar. Survival was a right no law could deny. In Rome, history itself was summoned to the stand. Mussolini's speeches echoed with names that belonged to marble ruins and triumphal arches. Rome had ruled before, therefore Rome could rule again. Abyssinia was described not as a sovereign nation, but as a space left unfinished by time. Italy was not expanding. It was fulfilling a destiny interrupted. When reports of atrocities surfaced, they were drowned out by ceremony. Parades, uniforms, promises of order. Civilization, the regime insisted, was being exported. Resistance, therefore, was backwardness. In Spain, the language shifted again, but the structure remained. Franco did not speak of borders or resources. He spoke of collapse, of churches burned, of traditions erased, of a nation dissolving into chaos. The Republic, he claimed, had forfeited its legitimacy. His uprising was not rebellion, it was rescue. Everywhere, violence arrived carrying paperwork. Declarations were issued. Emergency powers invoked. Votes promised, delayed, manipulated. Each action was framed as temporary, necessary, legal. The very systems designed to prevent war now demanded proof, procedure, consensus. And consensus took time. Democratic leaders found themselves trapped by their own principles. To oppose these moves required urgency, but urgency sounded like hysteria. The claims were complex. The facts are disputed. The public, exhausted by the memory of war, demanded certainty before sacrifice. And certainty never arrived. Meetings were held. Commissions formed. Notes exchanged. While arguments were weighed, soldiers dug in. Roads were built. Flags were raised. Reality settled into place. The brilliance of the strategy was not in its deception, but in its patience. By the time legality could no longer hide the violence no longer needed hiding. What had begun as correction had hardened into control. And those who might have stopped it were left explaining why they had hesitated, long after hesitation no longer mattered. The test did not come with an ultimatum or a declaration of war. It arrived quietly, far from Europe, in a region most delegates could barely locate on a map. Manchuria lay beyond the horizon of immediate concern. Vast, cold, rich in resources, and politically fragile. Japanese troops had been stationed there for years, officially to protect railways and commerce. Their presence was legal, their intentions less so. One night, an explosion tore through a section of railway near Mukden. The damage was minor. Trains could still pass. But by dawn, Japanese officers had their justification. Chinese sabotage, they said, an act of provocation, a threat to order. Within hours, troops moved. There was no grand invasion, no sweeping declaration. Positions were secured. Cities occupied. Communications seized. Each step was presented as temporary, defensive, unavoidable. The pace was deliberate, calculated to stay just below the threshold that might provoke immediate response. In Geneva, the news arrived in fragments. Reports contradicted one another. Facts were unclear. Was this an incident or an invasion? A response or an escalation? The League of Nations convened as it was meant to. Statements were drafted expressing concern. Japan was asked to explain its actions. Japan responded politely. It insisted that order had been restored, that civilians were protected, that the situation was under control, and above all, that this was an internal matter of security, not international aggression. Weeks passed. A commission was formed to investigate. Its members traveled slowly, crossing oceans, gathering testimony long after the reality on the ground had settled. By the time they arrived, Manchuria was effectively gone. When the report was finally presented, the conclusion was unmistakable. Japan had acted unlawfully. The occupation was condemned. The hall was silent as the verdict was read. Then the Japanese delegation stood, bowed, and walked out. There were gasps, murmurs, a sense that something extraordinary had just occurred, something that had not been anticipated in the careful language of charters and covenants. The League debated sanctions. Economic pressure was discussed, moral authority invoked, but no army mobilized, no blockade formed, no line was drawn, nothing happened. Japan remained in Manchuria. A new state was proclaimed. Flags changed. Administrations settled in. Life went on. Across the world, others were watching. They did not see chaos or collapse. They saw something far more instructive. A system that could be defied openly and survive the defiance only by accepting it. The League had spoken. Japan had acted. And action had prevailed. In that moment, the illusion shattered, not with noise, but with clarity. The rules still existed. The words were intact. But enforcement had revealed itself as optional. For the first time since the war, aggression had crossed a border and remained there unchallenged. The lesson was simple, and it did not remain confined to Manchuria. If the first test could be ignored, then every test that followed would be easier. The world had asked a question and received its answer. And the answer was silence. The lesson did not travel by speech or treaty. It moved through observation. In Rome, officials studied Manchuria with quiet interest. Not because of its geography, but because of its outcome. A great power had acted without permission, ignored condemnation, and emerged stronger. No blockade, no armies, no war. The system had bent and then stayed bent. Italy had its own grievances. Victory in the Great War had brought little reward. The economy was strained, unemployment high, and national pride wounded. Mussolini spoke of destiny and revival, of a people owed more than they had received. He did not need to invent an enemy. He only needed to choose one. Abyssinia lay at the edge of Europe's concern, ancient and sovereign, but militarily weak. Italy already possessed colonies on its borders. The justification wrote itself. Incidents were reported. Borders disputed. Insults exaggerated. When Italian troops moved forward, it was described not as an invasion, but as a response. Geneva reacted with familiarity. Condemnation followed. The League declared Italy the aggressor. Sanctions were imposed, carefully measured, deliberately limited. Oil was excluded. Shipping remained untouched. No nation wished to provoke a wider conflict. The punishment looked severe on paper. In practice, it changed nothing. Italian forces advanced steadily. Aircraft bombed from above. Villages burned. Gas drifted across the highlands, outlawed by international law, yet unanswered by international action. Each violation was recorded. Each outrage noted. Nothing stopped the war. Mussolini watched the sanctions closely. He saw that they inconvenienced but did not endanger. They rallied domestic support rather than weaken it. Italians were told they were being unfairly punished for asserting their rightful place in the world. The regime learned quickly. So did everyone else. By the time Addis Ababa fell, the verdict was unmistakable. A sovereign nation had been destroyed. The League had acted. The League had failed. Across Europe, the message landed with precision. Laws without force were suggestions. Punishments without consequence were survivable. Aggression once again had paid. The failure was no longer theoretical. It was visible, measurable, repeatable. The system had now failed twice, and failures, once proven, invite imitation. What followed abroad was mirrored at home. In countries shaken by war, depression, and humiliation, disorder had become the enemy people felt every day. Empty factories, worthless currency, governments that argued endlessly while nothing improved. Democracy to many no longer looked like freedom, it looked like paralysis. Authoritarianism arrived not with chains, but with promises. In Germany, the transformation was swift and visible. Construction sites spread across the landscape. Roads cut through the countryside where men had once stood idle. Uniforms appeared, orderly and purposeful. Unemployment numbers fell. For families who had lost everything to inflation and depression, the cause mattered less than the result. Something was finally working. The streets felt safer. The trains ran on time. Flags filled the air. Pride returned before fear did. Those who benefited did not see tyranny. They saw competence. In Italy, Mussolini staged an order like a theater. Parades marched through cities that had once been gripped by strikes and unrest. Corruption was punished publicly. The state projected strength at every level, from the railways to the schools. Italians were told they belonged to something larger again, an idea older than their frustrations, grander than their daily struggles. Felt like a rescue. In Japan, discipline has never disappeared, but now it has hardened into certainty. Military values spread beyond the barracks into classrooms and offices. Sacrifice was reframed as honor, obedience as virtue. The nation's problems were explained clearly and blamed outward. There was comfort in knowing who was responsible and what must be done. Across all three societies, the pattern was the same. Authoritarian rule simplified the world. It reduced confusion into commands, fear into purpose, complexity into slogans. For people exhausted by instability, this clarity was not frightening. It was soothing. Opposition existed, but it struggled to breathe. Not because everyone agreed, but because disagreement now felt dangerous to livelihoods, to unity, to survival. And many who sensed the danger told themselves it was temporary. That strength was needed first. Freedom could wait. From the outside, it was easy to speak of repression. From the inside, life appeared to improve. Wages came back. Order returned. National pride was restored. For millions, the trade felt rational. People did not wake up one morning and choose tyranny. They chose certainty over chaos, stability over argument, direction over doubt. And as long as life improved, few asked where that direction ultimately led. By the time the cost became clear, the system that had provided relief had already demanded loyalty. And loyalty, once given, was far harder to withdraw than consent. The regimes understood this instinctively. Control did not begin with terror. It began with relief. And relief, once felt, became something worth defending. Spain did not begin as a world war. It began as a fracture. When fighting broke out, it was described as an internal matter, another nation unraveling under the strain of ideology, class, and history. For the democracies watching from afar, that description was a relief. Civil wars were tragic, but they were not obligations. For Germany and Italy, Spain was something else entirely. Aircraft arrived first, their markings unfamiliar to most Spaniards. Tanks followed, then advisors, then soldiers who were officially volunteers. The language was careful. Assistance, support, aid to an ally. No one declared war. No treaties were broken openly. The rules bent just enough. What unfolded on Spanish soil was not merely a struggle for power, but an experiment. New bombers roared overhead, testing formations and tactics. Armored columns pushed forward, refining coordination between tanks, infantry, and air power. Radios crackled with instructions that would soon become standard elsewhere. The war moved faster, struck deeper, and ignored boundaries that had once restrained it. Cities became targets. Madrid burned, Barcelona shook, and then Guernica vanished beneath fire and rubble, its civilians caught beneath bombs dropped not to win a battle, but to test an idea. Terror from the air worked, panic spread, resistance weakened, and the world watched. Protests were voiced, newspapers condemned, committees debated, but no aircraft rose to challenge the bombers. No fleets sailed. No lines were crossed in response. The violence remained contained enough to be tolerated. For those conducting the experiment, the results were unmistakable. Air power could break morale. Civilian suffering could accelerate victory. And the democracies once again would not intervene. The lesson learned was not restraint. It was confidence. Spain became the rehearsal for a far larger stage. The wrong lesson was taught clearly. Brutality carried no immediate cost. While the war dragged on, another pattern continued elsewhere, quieter but just as decisive. In Germany, troops marched into the Rhineland, territory forbidden to them by treaty. The move was risky. German generals feared resistance. They had orders to retreat if challenged. No challenge came. The soldiers stayed. The success emboldened the regime, but it also reassured it. The democracies protested, but did not act. The gamble had paid off. What had once been unthinkable now seemed manageable. Austria followed. Pressure mounted. Threats were issued behind closed doors. When German forces crossed the border, they were greeted not by gunfire, but by cheers. The annexation was swift, bloodless, and again unopposed. Each move was justified as unique. Each response was framed as reasonable. Then came the Sudetenland. This time the risk was greater. Czechoslovakia was armed, fortified, and prepared to resist. War felt possible again. And so diplomacy rushed in to meet it. Meetings were held. Promises exchanged. Maps redrawn. In the name of peace, territory was surrendered. The concession was framed as a final settlement, a necessary compromise to avoid catastrophe. It worked, temporarily. War was avoided. Applause followed. Relief spread across Europe. Leaders returned home praised for preserving peace. But credibility had been spent. Each concession had been meant to buy time. And time was gained, but not for those who hoped to prevent war. It was gained by those preparing for it. The calculation was not foolish. It was human. Memories of the last war were still raw. Millions were unwilling to risk another. Delay felt merciful. Negotiation felt moral. But delay taught a lesson of its own. It taught that pressure worked. Those threats produced results. Those promises could be broken later without consequence. By the time it became clear that peace had not been preserved, only postponed, the balance had shifted. The aggressors were stronger. The democracies are more uncertain. The cost of resistance is far higher than it had been before. What had been a strategy became a trap. And the path that now lay ahead had been cleared not by malice alone, but by a series of decisions made in the sincere hope of avoiding disaster, decisions that, taken together, ensured it. There came a moment when the arguments stopped pretending. Until then, every move had arrived wrapped in explanation. Minorities to protect, borders to correct, peace to preserve. But after the concessions, after the applause faded, something changed. The language hardened. The patience vanished. What remained was power. Czechoslovakia was the turning point. It had complied. It had surrendered territory in the name of peace. It had trusted signatures and assurances given in full view of the world. And when it stood alone, stripped of its defenses and allies, there was no longer even an attempt to disguise what followed. German troops entered without resistance, not to reunite a people, not to resolve a grievance, but to take. No referendum was promised. No legal argument assembled. The invasion did not correct a wrong, it created one. A sovereign state was dismantled because it could be, and the reaction was immediate in its absence. There were protests, statements, expressions of regret, but no response. In that silence, the meaning of every earlier promise collapsed. Treaties were revealed as temporary conveniences, guarantees as conditional gestures. The system that had once claimed authority now exposed its limits. For those watching closely, the lesson was unmistakable. If a nation could be erased without consequence, then nothing was protected. Not borders, not agreements, not peace itself. Poland understood this instinctively. When demands followed corridors, ports, adjustments, the tone was different. There was no reassurance this time. No pretense that satisfaction would bring finality. Poland was not asked to comply so that peace could be preserved. It was pressured to comply so that conquest could be delayed. Poland refused. Behind closed doors, the calculations were already finished. Guarantees were issued at last, but they arrived late, weighed down by doubt. The words sounded stronger than before, yet the memory of inaction clung to them. Promises had lost their force. Diplomacy continued, but it no longer shaped events. It reacted to them. And reaction now was no substitute for resolve. The final preparations were made without secrecy. Mobilization followed timetable rather than justification. Orders were issued not to persuade, but to execute. When the moment came, it came without explanation. There was no appeal to history, no claim of defense, no language of correction, only movement. At that point, the system had already failed. The war did not begin because the rules were broken. It began because the rules had stopped mattering. And once force became the only language left, there was no longer a way back. By the summer of 1939, the world spoke the language of peace out of habit, not belief. The rituals continued. Diplomats traveled. Notes were exchanged. Assurances repeated. But the meaning had drained away. What remained was momentum. One uncertainty still lingered. To the east stood a power that could complicate everything. For years it had been denounced as an enemy, its ideology condemned, its intentions distrusted. Yet ideology, like legality before it, proved flexible when necessity demanded. When the announcement came, it felt unreal. Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn adversaries by doctrine and rhetoric, had reached an agreement. A non-aggression pact, the statement said. A commitment to peace between rivals. What it truly offered was freedom. In private clauses never meant for public eyes, borders were divided, futures assigned. Poland was reduced to geometry. States were traded like abstractions. The final risk, the danger of a two-front war, vanished overnight. The lesson learned over the previous decade was now complete. Treaties could be broken. Condemnations could be ignored. Sanctions could be endured. Concessions could be extracted. And alliances, even the most unlikely, could be formed when they served immediate purpose. Nothing remained to be tested. On the last night of August, preparations were carried out with routine precision. Orders were issued calmly. Soldiers were briefed. Engines warmed. There was no speech announcing destiny. No elaborate justification offered to the world. None was needed. At dawn, the border dissolved. Columns moved forward. Aircraft rose into the sky. Communications were cut. The operation unfolded exactly as planned. Fast, overwhelming, decisive. To those watching from afar, it appeared sudden, shocking, unthinkable. But nothing about it was sudden. Every mile advanced rested on earlier silences. Every bomb dropped echoed past hesitations. Every decision executed had been rehearsed, not only on battlefields, but in conference halls, committee rooms, and moments when action had been postponed. War had not arrived unannounced. It had been invited patiently, repeatedly, and without interruption. The guarantees issued in response were finally honored. Declarations followed. Armies mobilized. The world entered a conflict it claimed to have tried to avoid. Yet the beginning was only technical. The real beginning had come years earlier, when the first violation met no resistance. When the second confirmed the first. When legality was manipulated, punishment diluted, and delay mistaken for wisdom. By the time the guns spoke, the outcome had already been shaped. The war did not erupt. It concluded a process that had long been underway. And in that sense, the most devastating conflict in human history did not begin in 1939. It merely revealed what the world had already allowed to happen. By 1939, peace still existed as a word, but not as a conviction. It was spoken carefully, repeated often, and trusted by almost no one. What nations truly believed in was delay, the hope that tomorrow might be less dangerous than today, that postponement could substitute for resolve. Each year of hesitation had felt justified at the time. Each compromise had seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a path that narrowed quietly, until there was nowhere left to turn. When the final decisions were made, they felt abrupt only because the long prelude had been ignored. The outcome had already been shaped by every moment when action was deferred, every warning softened, every violation tolerated. Delay had bought time, but time had not brought safety. It brought certainty. And certainty, once reached, allowed no alternatives. The war that followed did not emerge from chaos or madness. It emerged from a pattern, one learned, reinforced, and finally applied without hesitation. By the time the world understood what delay had cost, the choice had already been made. Not by a single leader or a single nation, but by years of silence that spoke louder than any declaration ever could.